Hi, I'm Carrie Adams, and you're listening to Carrie's Connoisseurs, coming to you from Solid Gold Podcasts. Here we talk to the movers and shakers, the drinkers, the dreamers, and all the people who make it happen in the liquor and luxury industries from around the world. Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Carrie's Connoisseurs. It's a long time since I've been here, so welcome back. I have been here in the new year so far, but this is just the second one. Today I have an interesting friend and colleague with me in my studio. She's Dr. Anna Trapido. I'm going to call her Doctor because not many people know she's a doctor. And we'll get on to what she's a doctor of. And it's not wine and it's not food, but it should be. But Anna Trapido has worked in this industry with me for as long as I've been here. And now it's time to have fun. And we thought we'd start with a podcast. So, Anna, welcome.
Hello. Hi.
We've got a million things to speak about. At the moment, you are floating around doing, I think, largely South African tastes and flavours that bring people together in a happy space, at a happy table, where everything mixes together and melts together. You've got a vast knowledge of South African culture, and you're applying it to fun food and wine spaces. Expand a bit. Am I almost right?
Look, I think that what I definitely have is like a real sense of joy that I'm never not excited to be here, that I am the child of people of South Africans who went into exile. And my dad, who, had a whole life in Oxford, spent the whole time. So, whenever we went anywhere in England, he would say, well, it's not as nice as Cape Town. Or,
So your parents were born English?
No, my dad comes from Krugersdorp. And
oh,
my mother
gosh,
comes
we'll
from
forgive
Durban.
him for that.
I am always so excited to be in Krugersdorp. I read once there was a medieval monk who said that his approach, because you find all over the world, you find people whose bones say that they're Celtic in some way, but then they are in Spain, and that this monk said that you travel around until you find the place where the sky opens up and you're closest to God, and that's where you build your church.
He was probably Dom Perignon, wasn't he? He found God in a bottle, didn't he?
But he did. But I think that somehow for me that, probably because my father did this whole thing when I was little about how the only place worth being in was South Africa, that, I have traveled around, but ultimately, South Africa in general and this kind of Gauteng high felty space in particular is where the sky opens up and I'm closest to God.
So were you brought up in Krugersdorp?
No, I come from Oxford.
So they went to live in England?
Yes.
When you were little?
No, they went to live in England in 1963, and so I was born in England, but I just have such a sense that this is where I belong, and I am not, I don't have rose-tinted spectacles. I know all the things that are wrong. I don't ever lose that sense of joy, that I grew up in a house with all of these kind of political exiles who just always said in 5 years' time we'll be home.
And was your mum South African as well?
My mum comes from Durban. So I just sort of, in 5 years' time we'll be home, and they stretched that out almost indefinitely. 20 years later they were still in England. But the sense of, in 5 years' time, we were home, has never quite left me. That kind of little girl joy, that this magic
And when was
place.
the first time you came to South Africa?
But,
how old were you?
the ANC was unbanned and I came home. None of them came, all those grown-ups that had been saying in 5 years'
So
time.
had you been to South Africa before then?
I had visited grandparents occasionally, but I've never had a proper grown-up job in England. I've had waitressing jobs and stuff, but all my kind of grown-up life has been in South Africa. And
your parents never came back?
yeah, they did and they didn't, you know. But
You're starting to sound like a politician.
no, I mean, my dad was sort of desperate to be here. My mother had got very English in the meantime, but you know, had come from Durban anyway, so started off more comfortable in that space, you know. I don't think my father ever acquired an English friend in his entire kind of 30 years in England. You know, he used to play...
I think that's quite normal, actually.
Yeah.
If you go and live in England, it's quite hard to find a new friend.
Well, he played cricket in the park with Pakistanis and West Indians and Australians, and he had lots of friends, but, you know, if you'd asked him whether he had any English friends, I don't think he knew anybody.
So you were born and bred in England. You came to South Africa when? Which year?
1990.
Gosh.
The ANC was unbanned and I came home because that's what they'd said we were going to do all those years ago.
And what did you decide to do when you came home? What did you do then?
You know, I have a first degree from an English university in anthropology, and I got a job that turned into my PhD working on occupational health. So I worked in the former Transkei with old men who had been mine workers and who had gone home and then got sick because, you know, the diseases of mining have a latency period. So as a young man, you breathe in the dust, and as an older man, you get sick, and then you're stuck in the middle of the Transkei with a whole lot of foreign doctors who have no understanding of the migrant labour system and tell you what you've got is TB.
Why have we got foreign doctors then?
You know, there were doctors from
Cuba.
Bhutan.
I remember they got... no.
Actually, there weren't any. Cubans are so urban, they don't like being in the rural areas. They hot-footed to Cape Town pretty fast. But lots
It never ceased to amaze me that we needed to put foreign doctors into South Africa. It was one of those strange things that I never quite got.
Actually, what you need is fantastic nurses. That there are very few situations where you need a doctor. So
you got your doctorate in lung diseases?
Occupational lung disease in ex-mine workers in the Eastern Cape, which, as you can imagine, made me extremely popular with the Chamber of Mines. Because what I uncovered was an epidemic. And it's an epidemic that's compensatable, so that made me doubly unpopular.
Yes.
But, you know, I'm not a very good epidemiologist in that... Epidemiologists have to think in populations, you know, it's diseases in populations. I like individuals, so I used to sit in the queues with all these old men while they waited for their x-rays, like asking them how they met their wife and, you know, chatting and all of that. And mine was the only occupational health project that had... I used to get up at dawn and, like, roast chickens, and there were two kinds of bread, and you could decide whether you wanted brown or white, whether you wanted, you know...
And how were you making money whilst you were doing all of this? Because you have to live, don't you?
Well, I was employed by the Medical Bureau for Occupational Diseases, which
was in those days still the Nat government, I would imagine.
No, well, all of my stuff is post-94.
Is it post-94?
And you know what was amazing? There was that brief period when people thought, oh, okay, well, maybe everything is different. So suddenly there was, like, this kind of 20-year-old with an English accent in the middle of, like...
the Eastern Cape.
Rural Transkei, saying, did you know that you're eligible for compensation? And if you all line up, we'll do x-rays and, you know, I'll fill in the forms, which, you know, all of that. And, you know... we got masses of compensation. I mean, this is a whole other podcast.
Yes,
but,
yes.
You know, there's nothing that makes people love you as much as...
giving them money.
Pointing out to them that there's money that they are entitled to, that you can facilitate that happening. So, you know, I still talk to some of those people. That I've got
nice
babies
to know that they're
named
still
after
alive.
me, that I've got, you know, I used to come back with chickens on the plane from what was then KD Matanzima Airport. But I think what I discovered in that process is that I really like all sorts of South Africans, that I actually don't mind if they're in the Transkei or Krugersdorp. I just think they're all great.
So you came home and found... well, you came not home, because home is England for you, but you came to South Africa and found a home.
I found the place where the sky opened up and I was closest to God.
And that takes us to what you're doing now, or what you have been doing, which is why I met you
Yeah.
in the world of food and wine. And you've done so much work in learning about, dare we call it indigenous food? Is it indigenous food? What do you call it?
Some of it's indigenous and some of it is heritage. And there's
What's the difference?
That indigenous means you
It's made
evolved
here.
in this environment.
Indigenous is grown here,
sorghum,
yeah.
for instance, evolved in this environment.
And heritage being?
Heritage means that it's been here so long. Chilies, for instance, are not indigenous to Africa, but they have evolved in this space such that there are varieties
So
that
you're
only
heritage.
exist here.
You weren't born here,
we
but
both
you've been here for
heritage.
so long.
You know, I think,
You've become it.
That people in that is complicated because there's only certain sorts of people that are indigenous in this space, and they're often not the people who will use the term about themselves. But that's a whole other debate. That I think that what I know about and that Eastern Cape experience sort of gave me the beginnings of that is, I am an anthropologist by training initially. That's what my first degree is in. So
And
I
if
know
I
the
were
theory.
to ask you to tell us if I'm Carrie Adams, an anthropologist, what do I do every day? What does an anthropologist do every day?
Well, there's what I do is I look inside people's pots and ask them nosy questions, and then try and work out what that kind of cultural expression says about who they are. If we are what we eat, who are we? Is kind of what I ask.
So anthropology is steeped in cultural behaviours. Is that what it is?
Anthropology is the study of culture, but that you can do that in a range
Through
of
different
spaces.
mediums,
You
yeah.
can music,
And you chose food
and
flavours and tastes.
It's what I like is to kind of nose around in other people's pots. So I would be doing that anyway, and I mean, I'm being a bit rambly, but
You're allowed to be.
the other thing I've done is gone to chef school and worked in restaurants. So I know about cooking, I know about culture, and I know about health. And I tend to sort of put those
the
all
three
together. Into a jumble that is a small niche, but it's kind of mine.
Yes. And if we're talking cultural and heritage style flavours, what do you think is the predominant cultural flavour of South Africa?
Look, everywhere is very terroir specific. That's as true as France as it is of South Africa.
Yes.
So the flavours of Limpopo are not the same as the flavours of the
Are they
Western
that
Cape,
diverse?
Oh, they're very diverse.
Are
I
they?
mean, this is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, and a lot of that diversity is edible. That I think if I was to blindfold you and feed you a spoon and for you to say, I think this tastes like South Africa, the way that if I blindfold you
What
and
would
fed
that
you
be?
Mexican,
What would be the
you would
taste?
know.
Yes, what would be the taste of South
And
Africa?
again, it's very regional, it's very culturally specific and those things. But I would say, for me, fermented is a big thing. So whether that be fermented dairy and tastes like amasi, so that kind of combination of like creamy and sour at the same time would be one of those. You feed it to me with a blindfold, I know I'm in South Africa. The same with kind of fermented grain, so the kind of soured quality
Sorghum
that you
and
get
stuff.
and that again, there's a kind of, it's not just sour. There's a kind of
There's a
generous,
sweetness to it, a sweet and sour.
earthy thing when you ferment sorghum into things like ting. That I think is very central. That combination of sour and sweet. That actually other sorts of South Africans do. So the way that sweet and the savoury is so common because of that kind of Cape experience. Whether
The Afrikaners are very into sweet and
Afrikaners
savoury,
love
which comes, I
that.
think, from the Cape Malays, really.
Well, it's partly
Largely.
Asian. It is Cape Malay. Absolutely, there's a Cape Malay element in that. But there's also that the Dutch had been in Asia for a long time.
100%. They love
before
curry
that.
and
the Crusades, actually. So all of that stuff like cinnamon in the pumpkin and all of those warming spices, that's, the Crusades were the kind of first food tourism in lots of ways. They brought back so much that's now central to European cuisine, that all the dried fruit, if you think about the way like Cape flavours often
put raisins and sultanas and
raisins
things into
in
everything.
rice.
Oh my God, yes.
And all that apricot stuff is very capey. And that's probably...
I always thought that was Malayish.
Well, apricots, what's interesting about apricots, because you don't get apricots in Indonesia, which is, Cape Malay is a funny term because very few of them are from Malaysia. But that in the Cape, apricots grow very well, but they don't preserve, you can't, it's not like an apple, you can't just leave it on the shelf or in the fruit bowl. Apricots, you have to start preserving
stewed
them.
Or something, yeah.
And in an era before sugar is cheap, which is true of the early Cape, they're preserving in salt. So something like meebos, for instance, that Cape Malay people come from Indonesia with a tradition of preserving plums in salt. But they don't know apricots. They find apricots at the Cape. And in fact, those preserved plums, which still exist in Asian cuisine, and are called umiboshi. And you think, well, that's just meebos, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you get to the Cape, you take this Asian technique of preserving in salt, preserving fruit in salt, and you apply that to the fruit that grows best at the Cape, which is apricots. And you get that sweet, salty, delicious meebos thing.
I love it.
I adore meebos. I mean, that feels to me like a core flavour of South Africans. It's not just a Cape flavour. It's that sweet and the savoury, the fruity thing that's a bit salty, that stuff that South Africans call chutney that's quite different from what like Indian people from India think chutney is, etc.
Is there chutney anywhere else in the world? It's not called
like
chutney.
what we think chutney is.
It's like Branston pickle in England, or it's not really called chutney anywhere else.
No, it isn't.
It's so totally South African.
And Indians are very puzzled when you say this is chutney. They say no, it's not.
What do they call it? Achar.
Well, again, what we think achar is, and the fights, I've been having such wonderful fights with people around, because, like, if you ask people from Limpopo, if you say, here is achar, and you put in front of them what Indians from India think achar is, they fight. They're actively enraged because achar for South Africans in general, but South Africans from northern regions.
So it's quite interesting because it's all really cultural appropriation that there's lots of aggro about around the world.
Food. Fusion is what
I like
humans
to think
do.
of it as fusion food because when you've got multi sort of diversity in a country and you've got, well, let's say a very diverse heritage background. I mean, we've got injections from all over the world in South Africa and have had for the last 700, 800, 900 years. And they all leave their stamp.
At Mapungubwe.
They all leave their
always been
stamp,
part of
don't
the
they?
world.
But speaking right here and now, in the 21st century, and Carrie and Anna are sitting in a studio, if I said close your eyes and think of England and tell me a smell.
For England?
Well, that's just because it's a saying. Close your eyes and think of England. I would
depressing.
smell roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. If I say close your eyes and think of China, what would you smell in their kitchen?
And you think probably star anise is their kind of core smell.
From
But
China?
again,
From China, no. I could
it's so
smell
regional.
Rice. I could just smell rice.
But I mean,
If I said
these
close
don't
your
mean
eyes and
anything,
think
these
of
statements.
America.
Because, like,
It's probably-
where in America do you mean?
Listen to me. You're not listening to the question. If I said I'm looking for a collective adjective, if I said close your eyes and think of smells and flavors of America, what would it be? As an uneducated American foodie, it would probably be a hot dog.
It would depend. If I was
Just say
talking about
yes or
New
no.
York, no.
No, we can't do. We're talking about a country. We're talking about a culture.
But the French don't do that. They don't say this is French food. They say this is food
of
from
course
Normandy
they
and this
do.
is food from
the French
Provence.
are so culturally appropriate. They think they're the best in the world with food, and some of the time they are. But if I think of France, I think of French onion soup. I think of mussels. I think of snails. I think of all things French. What is the main thing from South Africa that you think of? That's what I'm trying to get at.
I still think...
And you're
as
not
a-
allowed to cut it up into provinces.
But why not? Given that you're the wine girl, that surely the whole point is that terroir really matters.
Terroir does
and that
matter,
South
but
Africa is big.
If you think of it, you can get something in almost every province. You can grow almost anything. We've got the most alarming, we had the most alarming climate. So you can grow things better in some provinces than in others. But the whole country, you can farm cows, cattle, and sheep, as my baby used to call them. You can farm meat. You can farm dairy. The avos sort of thrive in the Eastern Transvaal. The citrus thrives in the Eastern Transvaal. Fruit in the Cape, grapes, peaches, plums. But as a country, we've got sort of one of everything. Is there a single flavour, taste, smell, aromatic dish
that
we could say is South African?
Lots.
No.
I'm going lots. But, if you want me to say, is there a flavour that belongs to certain parts of Limpopo, I would say marula nuts, the kind of opulent generosity, creaminess of marula nuts. If you want me to say the flavours of the Western Cape.
Okay, so you haven't got a South African one. We'll localise them then, Anna.
I think we need to. Terroir is important, and that
terroir is.
Different cooks in different. The thing about humans is that all cultures have people who cook well and people who cook badly. That's as true of the French as it is of the Chinese. But within that, the ways in which they make delicious differ. So to say French delicious or American delicious means this, is to underestimate how delicious those places are, that...
But look, I totally get that each little region in every corner of the world has its own special secret space. But I think there are most definitely, personally, things that pertain specifically to a nation.
I tell you what.
And if I were to say, I would say the flavours and smells of South Africa are fruit-driven, and they are largely sweet. I think South Africans like sweet, fruit-driven flavours.
Yes. I think, what I do know is what Sunday afternoon smells like everywhere in South Africa. That if you go for a walk with your dog, it doesn't matter if you're in Kakamas or Cape Town or Alexandra or wherever, that Sunday afternoon smells like smoke, like coriander seed, and like animal fat, usually lamb. So that kind of boerewors in the air smell is the smell of Sunday. And actually, again, like boerewors, because we're just all so used to it and it's in every supermarket, we don't notice that that's one of the world's really great sausages, It's a fantastic sausage.
We love boerewors. But that was a relatively newer thing that the Afrikaners brought, didn't they? Nobody knew about boerewors before in Afrikaner.
Well, it's a farmer's sausage that if you look at it, it's, certainly in the Cape, it's much more, it's very seldom got pork in it. So, there's definitely a kind of Asian element, a kind of Muslim food taboo element in it. That, again, coriander seed is a thing that, whether that comes back with the Crusades into Holland or whether that comes with...
We grow coriander in South Africa. I don't think we do, really. Yeah. I mean, we do latterly, but growing up, we never had coriander in South Africa. I don't ever remember
it.
Me.
If you were in Work Up Gardens, you'd have found coriander. It kind of bolts quite easily, is my experience of coriander, is that it will grow quite happily and then just suddenly it makes flowers and it says, no, I've had enough now. So
moving on from that, because we could carry on and on and on and on, but there are very specific, as in any country in the world, there are very, very specific flavours and flavour profiles that conjure up all kinds of memories and
the kind of Madeleine moment thing.
Happiness. It's a happy place. For me, food and wine is my happy place. So you are so well versed in all the local flavours and the spectrum of smells and availability of things that a lot of people have never even heard of. Let's be honest. You talk about things, I don't know what you're talking about a lot of the time. When we're speaking food, there's nuts, there's berries, there's dishes, there's all kinds of things that I know nothing about. I would rather fall pregnant with triplets and give birth to them with no epidural than eat a goat stew. I've never eaten a goat in my life.
You really wouldn't.
I've never eaten a goat in my life. Am I missing out?
Yes, you are. You know, there again, this is a very biodiverse space, that there are so many edible ingredients, and some of them are, have made it into a kind of mainstream urban supermarket space.
Yeah.
And some of them haven't. But we are really missing out. There are some really good flavors. That one of the things
that's what I want you to tell us about.
I've been doing recently is teaching at lodges that Singita own, mainly in the Kruger Park. So that kind of Mpumalanga, edge of Limpopo kind of territory. And it was interesting because I took a whole range of flavors with. I was teaching chefs and waiters and some of the sort of senior management staff, because they were saying, we are, people pay lots of money to come here. They want a unique experience.
They want an African experience.
But they want it to be perfect and delicious and luxurious, and we can only have it here. That if we wanted to be in Paris having perfect, delicious, luxurious, we would be there.
Yeah.
Their guests are people who could be anywhere. They have chosen to be here. How do you reflect that on the plates? So, I took a whole lot of ingredients that I knew were indigenous and heritage to that space.
Yes.
And, their kitchens are quite diverse. Everybody in those kitchens is highly skilled and can cook in that kind of fine dining way. But, some of them are, white people from Cape Town. Some of them are people who come from the communities surrounding the park, etc. So they had different experiences with those ingredients. Some of them had never seen them before. Some of them knew them quite well, but hadn't considered that they might use them in that space. So, for instance, the first thing I said to them was, what salt have you got on the tables? And they all knew the answer to that. They said, well, we've got Malden on the tables. And we all love Malden. But, you can buy Malden in London, you can buy Malden in Paris. Where does Malden come from? We don't know. So we established that Malden was not local. Half an hour up the road is Baleni salt.
Salt pans.
Now, Baleni, literally, the archaeology says that they've been mining salt there for 2,000 years, that... that this is a great ancient salt. It's got all these spiritual connotations. It's got an interesting story for the waiters to tell. It comes from just up the road, so the carbon miles are much less than flying in Malden. The exchange rate doesn't hit you, in all sorts of ways. Why have you got Malden on your luxury
And is
table?
nobody marketing Baleni salt?
Just somehow it hadn't occurred to anybody in that space, whether they were locals or imports.
What are they doing with the salt?
There's salt on the table, so when they bring the bread,
what are they doing with the salt that's coming from that salt mine?
Oh, they're selling it all over the world. You can buy it at Galerie Lafayette in Paris at this point. It's in the Arc of Taste kind of slow food, epic ingredient listing, etc. This salt is internationally acknowledged to be wonderful. It's just that somehow in the Smart Lodge, when you look at what's on the table, it's Malden. And that, for instance, one of the ingredients I had brought was this thing that's called nkwakwa. Now, nkwakwa is actually... I don't know, have you ever had a monkey orange? Do you know, in English
I've seen a monkey orange, but I've not eaten one. So, I think it's quite bitter, isn't it?
It's not bitter, but it is quite tart, and more tart. Than anything...
I think I did have a taste.
It's irritating because the flesh clings to the pips very tight. And you know the way with a lychee, you think, no, this is more effort than it's worth.
I know.
Actually...
Except at least the lychee's got a nice, shiny, smooth pip.
But
so you can actually... bite the flesh off.
With a monkey orange, what people do in those communities that surround the Kruger Park is you dry the seeds with the flesh on. Once it's dried, sun-dried, then it comes off very easily.
Has it got any nutritional value?
Oh, huge nutritional value. It's got more vitamin C than an orange,
Really?
and magnesium and the full catastrophe. But so you've got this dried fruit that people pound, and they have this, it's sort of almost the colour, it comes this colour, like slightly deeper, like almost like
amberish.
Like between amber and terracotta, that kind of intense coppery kind of, and it's got the texture, once it's been pounded, of like brown sugar, like good quality brown sugar, and a taste that, you know, if you were to say dark chocolate or espresso, or so it's sweet, but it has got a slightly bitter kind of complex depth to it, and so I put the Nkwakwa in front of people, and those people in the teaching group who came from that area, they all know Nkwakwa. Yeah, it's Nkwakwa, we know that. And they were all just like, you take a tablespoon and eat it, because people eat it just like as an energy snack. That the people who didn't come from that area had never seen it before.
I want to make creme brulee with
it. It's fantastic on vanilla ice cream, we discovered.
That's what I want to make. I'm sitting here thinking.
You know, the mixologists, because they do all these very fancy cocktails for the very fancy people, instantly said, well, this is for our espresso martinis, and we're taking that. And they went away and they made these fantastic martinis using the Nkwakwa. So there's another kind of example.
So I think what we're saying is that there's a wealth, an absolute treasure trove of largely unknown ingredients and flavour profiles, phenols, aromatics, all the things that we need.
So delicious.
And the reason that I got you here in the first place, and you would never believe it because we're talking so much about other stuff.
So no, we've hardly talked about
there are two reasons that I invited Anna on today. The first is that she contacted me and said, Carrie, have you seen this? Should we do some kind of an interview about the fact that Paul Perlet was put into a wine tasting, quite a fancy schmancy wine tasting with some other rather upmarket wines at the Rand Club quite recently, and it was a blind tasting, so nobody knew what was in the tasting. And Paul Perlet featured rather well.
It did quite
at
well.
At 39 Rand a bottle as opposed to 200 and something Rand a bottle for all the others. So the infradig, rather poor relation, did quite well to everybody's surprise. And then it got us to thinking and speaking about, you know, he whose name should never be mentioned in wine circles, Tassenberg, Autumn Harvest Crackling, Paul Perlet, Jerapigo, you know, all that sort of stuff that we all actually quite like. And we never admit to, and we would never. I do sometimes. Sometimes people come to my house and they're alarmed. I'll have box wine in my fridge. I don't mind that. I really don't mind. There's some nice box wine. Donnie de Wet makes lovely box wine at the moment. But as that aside, we thought that it might be quite fun to legalize dropping your pants on Park Station and admitting to a bottle of Paul Perlet in your fridge, or God forbid, what are the other things that we get so used? We've got
brandy. I have
Commando
a very soft
brandy.
spot in my heart for.
We love, you know, that's one thing that I know the Afrikaners did bring to South Africa, which we do. Dare I say it, the French will never, your puts no speak to me again. The French will never speak to me again, but we make such gorgeous brandy. It's akin to cognac that everybody pays billions for, but we make lovely brandy. There's nothing wrong with Commando brandy. And whilst you do get a little bit of a headache in the winter, if it's sort of almost payday and you are freezing cold, a bottle of old brown sherry can be quite comforting at night.
And so delicious in a stew instead of stock. There's the sweet and the savoury thing again.
Yes.
An entire bottle of old brown sherry
bottle
in a lamb curry instead of stock is damn fine.
So that was part of this podcast, was to just endorse the fact that you're not to feel embarrassed. If you look at the shelf and you think, I wonder what this uber ultra extra cheap person is going to taste like, because everybody's told me that I should never partake. There are some incredibly good, inexpensive brands as I say, those who should never be mentioned. They're nice. Some of them are very nice.
Look,
some of them are dreadful. I'm not going to sit here and endorse everything, but I'm just saying that was very interesting to see that the Paul Perlet actually featured quite well in a lineup of some much loftier partners in the tasting.
About just being open to the idea that lovely can be lovely wherever it comes from. That
absolutely,
we're not saying never drink grander wine again. We are not arguing that Paul Perlet is
5-star
up with the greatest wines in the world.
Yeah.
We're just saying
it's okay.
Very pleasant.
It's okay.
It's remarkably cheap. That a lot of why we don't drink it is around either snobbery or inhibitions that it's like
exactly
can't
that.
drink a wine
and
with a handle.
Having said that, we're very, very lucky in South Africa that we can still do that. Because if you travel the world, the cheaper the wine gets, almost indescribably awful it becomes.
Exactly. French bad
you
wine
really,
is very,
and some
very
of the
bad.
Italian stuff, you just can't, and some of that Eastern European stuff as well, it's just awful. South Africa has a way, and I think, dare I say it, I'm probably going to get shot down in flames again, but it's that same love of sweetness. Sugar seduces anybody.
Well, if you think about
sugar seduces anybody, and if you put just enough sugar into something to make it seductive, it's nice.
It's pleasantly balanced. There's enough dry, there's enough sweet.
Yeah, there's some acid.
There's the pretty kind of
a bit of bubblies. It's a little bit petulant.
Feels a bit festive on a Thursday afternoon when you've got no money at the end of the month, kind of thing. That. There's nothing wrong with those things.
No.
What we kind of talk about things that are, we say easy drinking as though that's a bad thing. It's like,
I know, it's something that you sort of say it's easy drinking. I mean, you don't sort of say it's easy drinking.
Easy drinking is easy drinking. That's, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Doesn't mean that
the other thing is that I'm a big proponent of entry-level drugs.
Right.
So, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So, I can remember when we all started drinking. I mean, I was brought up in an era where children didn't drink at all, and it's something that we do need to be very wary of. But when you get to an age 18 and over and you start experimenting with alcohol and what you'd like to drink, dare I say, we all drank sweet stuff, didn't we? I mean, I certainly didn't go to Bellingham Grand Cru as my first choice when I was 18. It was there, it was available, but I tasted it once and I thought, I never want to drink that again. But your palate becomes honed. And those wines that we're talking about are made specifically, they're our Volkswagen Beetle wines. They drive the nation. Everybody has a bottle in their cellar, whether they admit to it or a history of it. Of some description. And I think all we're saying is that you don't have to be embarrassed or ashamed of that history. It's fine. If that's what you feel like, do it. But don't forget that it leads you to better things. It leads you to the Rolls Royce that you hopefully, if you work hard, one day you can have a cellar full of Rolls Royces if you want them. But in the meantime, there's nothing wrong.
Or you can have both.
Hopefully, I have
the
both
Rolls
in mind.
Royce and the Beetle.
100%.
Because sometimes you need to drive the Beetle and sometimes you need to drive the Rolls Royce.
In fact, most times we all have to drive the Beetle.
Both,
and sometimes you just need the sort of Toyota Corolla in between. It's fine. It's like anything else. But the reality is that in a time where, a lot of people can't even afford to pay their bond, never mind worry about buying expensive wine, it's okay to buy a bottle of Paul Perlet. And you'll find that you've got used to some quite different stuff. And I'm sure that you're not going to restock your entire cellar with Paul Perlet. But it's just a reminder that the quality of wine in South Africa, I really do believe that we have across the board in South Africa, we have one of the best quality spectrums of wine producing countries in the world. I do believe that.
No, absolutely. And my history with Paul Perlet was that I was making risotto and I wanted something just to kind of like chuck in to deglaze the pot. And I was feeling too mean to buy fancy wine. And I discovered that you can have 2 liters for 66 rand. And so I bought this thinking, how bad can it be? And
then you poured, to be honest, you snuck yourself a glass.
Well, the thing is
whilst you were cooking.
Nobody needs 2 liters to deglaze a pot. So then you've got like 1.5 liters left over, and you think, what now? So let's drink this with the risotto.
So why did you buy 2 liters in the first place, Doris?
I mean, it does come in a 1 liter container, which you can have for 39 rand.
How does it come? Does it come still in those flagons?
That's the 2 liter one with the handle.
Okay.
And like, I think we have to like get over the idea that if wine comes with a handle, that's a bad thing, because
I know it does.
It's also quite cool.
It could also.
I think retro chic.
It doubles up as a sort of a weapon. At a certain stage of the evening as well.
And the very thick glass, and so you have to say this is not for design snobs. That the very thick glass and the very
it's not particularly
old
sort of
and all of that,
Armani-ish or anything.
Except that the logo is so iconic.
Yes,
and it's so rooted in our sense of heritage and identity. And I think if you're saying you will not consider drinking Paul Perle ever, if you're saying I am
that's
the
a
sort of
bit
person,
stupid, really.
if you are actually saying I don't like myself as a South African, because this is so part of a national identity, and these are old.
They are old. Do you remember the old Bellingham Johannesburger bottle? It was like that shape. It was like a bunch of grapes.
And
Do you
are
remember?
you sure that it doesn't say? I think we need to go to the bottle
have a
store
look.
right
And we need
away.
to actually have another podcast where we speak about those wines that launched a South African wine industry 350 years, nearly 400 years ago. They are iconic. And we all had, I think all of our mothers had at least one Bellingham Johannesburger bottle that they'd put a candle into. And all the restaurants had those with a candle on each table. Do you remember?
And more than that, it's, that because what we're describing is sort of middle-class white urban mummies. And we love those. That we're both of us those anyway ourselves. But that connection with heritage spreads
important.
Across all sorts of South Africans. That I've got my friend Linda, who grew up in rural Natal. When I said, "Hi, I've discovered Paul Perle's fabulous," she said, "Oh God, my dad drank that," and everybody, and in fact,
has a memory of it.
With things like Commando brandy. That brandy is being made at the Cape from the late 17th century.
Oh gosh!
And it's actually already in the Eastern Cape by the early 18th century, and is being incorporated into all sorts of traditional rituals. And
that's the other thing that we
heritage.
need to speak about.
It's not just
I'm
like
not
somehow
sure.
a Joburg urban heritage. It's everyone.
No, it's the whole country, which is why at the beginning of the podcast I was trying to say as a nation,
right?
What do we like? And there's all these things that make up our pet loves and hates about South Africa. The next podcast that we do, because we're running out of time now, and we had so much to speak about, but the next one is a fascinating one that I know you're the goddess of, and that is South African wine and ancestors, and dare I call it witchcraft? Dare I call
you
it...
dare not. That we can be calling it healing and
no, but that's witchcraft.
But
that's witchcraft. I'm a white witch. I'm totally open to it. I can heal you like you can't believe with a bottle of wine. You have no idea. But joking apart, there is a big heritage. Or not heritage. There's a big folklore. Let's call it folklore, for want of being shot down in flames. That the ancestors heal, and wine is a large part of it. Am I right?
I think we call it heritage, and there's a lot of dead people using wine in Southern Africa.
Dead people?
The ancestors have very specific opinions on wine.
What do they like? Cabernet, Sauvignon Blanc, what do they like?
They don't tend to go by varietal. They have brands.
And which brands do they like?
And the brands, again, are quite terroir specific. What what ancestors in Bushbuck Ridge want is quite different from what ancestors in Pondoland
Well, the ancestor in Bushbuck Ridge didn't know what wine was, because you can't make wine in Bushbuck Ridge.
No, but ancestors in Bushbuck Ridge, they like Jarapigo and Tussenberg, and they ask for it very specifically, in very specific circumstances. No, the dead
I have to do this podcast with
are
you.
buying so much wine, and they're doing it. They are very brand loyal, and I do not think that the South African
tell me,
wine
how
industry
do we-
understands
how
how
do we
grateful
think-
they need to be
I'll
to
just-
the dead.
I'll toss it into the mix for you to keep in your think tank
Right.
for when we speak the next time. How do you think the ancestor from Bushbuck Ridge from 300 years ago knew about Tussenberg?
Oh, I know the answer to this. I can give you
Tell
a
me
very
quickly.
long.
Quick. No, I want a quick one.
The thing is you are conjuring up, you do this thing called ukupahla, which opens communication channels with the spiritual realm.
Okay.
So you pour alcohol on the ground.
That specific brand.
Then the ancestors arrive, and they can be either people you're directly related to, or people who are in some way connected to those that you were related to. So if your ancestor was a soldier and killed someone in battle, the person who he killed in battle can turn up when you sort of conjure up the spiritual realm. That chomis come up all the time, and quite often the ancestor might be African but brings a white person. He had a friend who is asking for Jarapigo, who is a dead white person. And increasingly, as white people in rural areas become less and less common in southern Africa, they are associated with heritage. So there's especially around Bushbuck Ridge, there's a lot of white dead people turning up at Twasa ceremonies and asking for things because all ancestors do is they ask for things that they knew in life. So they always ask for older brands. They never ask for shooters. They ask for brands that they know.
I think that Distill will be absolutely thoroughly over the moon to hear that people in Bushbuck Ridge 300 years ago knew about their Jarapigo. What unbelievable marketing. They've lost their marketing touch,
so
clearly.
Brand loyal. They just absolutely, if it's Commando or Viceroy or whatever it is, because the requests are regional, like in Pondoland,
and how does the request come through?
No, they ask for it.
How do they ask for it?
They tell you.
Through whom?
Because the people with the kind of spiritual gift can bring forth that voice comes out of them. So
and have you been to some of those rituals?
Yeah. No, I've absolutely been
and
to
those rituals. And is it festive and fun, or is it a bit spooky?
Both. It depends on what the ritual is and what it's for, like baby naming ceremonies and, the amount of brandy in wedding negotiations, bride wealth negotiations, for instance. And again, very specific brands and, for very specific purposes. The amount of wine and distilled kind of wine adjacent things that is being sold for traditional purposes, and yet we never see that in the marketing.
No,
I don't think anybody in the brandy industry
that's why we
said
need to speak
you.
about it. Do they even know?
I'm not even sure,
I'm sure they
that
don't
people
know.
even know that a lot of people are bathing in Paul Perle to take off negative energy and evil spirits, that people are pouring it on the ground, not necessarily being swallowed, this wine, but, a sale is a sale. And these are profoundly linked to identity and heritage, and we are a wine producing country, and somehow we as marketers often assume that only like posh people around a dinner table are using that wine, and yet there's like boxes and boxes. Initiation time of year, like in sort of December, the amount of brandy being sold in the Eastern Cape, mothers of an initiate in the Eastern Cape come dancing out with bottles of brandy around their necks. That if you are the mother of a new man, you've done this amazing thing. You've taken this boy through this transition and created this whole kind of man that through all the difficulties, and then through the terror of taking your boy to initiation and he might not come back, and you are very special. And one of the ways you show you are special is that you've got like garlands of brandy around your neck, you know, because brandy is the way that you communicate with the ancestors. You make a bridge with the past, you make a bridge with those yet to be born, that it's profoundly spiritual, you know.
Fascinating. Well, it's definitely food for thought and definitely material for another podcast.
And delicious.
We
love
good
wine.
It's absolutely delicious. So we'll definitely make that happen, and I'll get you to put something together that we can pass on to the masses, because I'm fascinated. I had no idea that they were using...
Quite how much brandy dead people are drinking.
Listen, I'm thrilled to hear it. Thrilled. I've spent my life being an apostle of the grape, you know. I have to be. So I'm very thrilled to hear it. Anna, you are charming and delightful, and as ever, just so nice. Too much time has gone by.
I hope that wasn't
We've
insane.
rambled on for too long, but I hope you enjoyed it. We'll have another one. And we will chat about the special rituals and things surrounding the fruits of the grape from the Cape. Thank you very much for watching.
Another production from Solid Gold Podcasts.